The people of Syria should decide their own fate and their future, and foreign countries should only help to improve conditions for this dialogue and for decision-making by the people of Syria.
Welcome back. We're talking about the ongoing conflict and the future of Syria. Joining us from Los Angeles is the political scientist and scholar Majid Rafizadeh. With us from Las Vegas is Eric Draitser. He's a geopolitical analyst and commentator. And joining us from New York is an international affairs scholar with the Century Foundation, Stephen Schlesinger. Thanks all for joining us. Again, Eric, I cut you off before the break, so I'm going to jump in with you. You know, all this lofty talk at the UN, it's great that 5 permanent members of the Security Council all on the same page, although it's not a resolution. But what about on the ground in Syria? You know, there's a deep cynicism both inside Syria with the population and in the refugee camps that anything is going to change. Can we see a glimmer of hope going forward with the diplomatic activity?
Well, on the ground, there are a number of factors, I think, that really, make the strategic calculus, and most importantly has to do with foreign influence. Remember that the fighting that the Syrian Arab Army, that is the Syrian military, has carried out in Zabadani against the militants has been successful. The fighting that they have carried out in certain parts of Hasaka and Idlib province has also been successful. And so what you've seen then, though, is that the Syrian army is in many ways outmatched by a number of forces that have been pushing into the country. We know in the Idlib province, the Turks have been backing a number of rebel groups as well as terrorist organizations. And I just want to push back a little bit on the idea that the United States and some of its allies, such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, are primarily interested in combating ISIS. Of course, we should look at the recently revealed 2012 memo from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which said quite clearly the United States understood there was an extremist group forming that became ISIS, and they were willing to accept the risk because they believed it would be an asset in the regime change strategy. That has, of course, backfired, and now you have a conflagration scenario inside of Syria. And so I think the real question with regard to Assad and with regard to the future of Syria on the ground has to do with, A, will the Syrian military and the Syrian government be allowed to continue their fight against the militants as they have done over the course of these last 4 years? And B, will the foreign funding, foreign influence, foreign provided weapons be cut off? And that is the role that Saudi Arabia and Turkey have to play. We should remember, in 2012, the New York Times documented the role of the CIA working with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey to funnel weapons into that country. Reuters covered the fact that there were terrorist training camps inside of inside of Turkey as well. The role of international actors is fundamental to the calculus on the ground, and until that's addressed and until that's cut off, you won't see a change on the ground in Syria.
Eric, thanks for your points. Everyone agrees that this is pretty much a proxy war at this stage. Majid, can I bring you in and talk about what Stephen said before the break? This Iran nuclear deal, is it transactional in terms of just limited to that, or do you see spillover in terms of cooperation to end this war, given the fact, as Eric alluded to, there has been military reverses by the Assad government in the last few months, which makes the government look a little bit more wobbly than it has since the start of this civil war 4 years ago?
Yeah, well, Iran Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif said that before they reached an agreement, he said that if there was a nuclear deal, he will have more power in comparison to the hardliners in Iran. But I think at the end of the day, from my perspective, the nuclear deal is not transformational. As you mentioned, it's transactional in a sense that Iran's foreign policy, it's not going to be fundamentally changed, as the same for other countries. Russia is not going to change its foreign policy. United States is not going to change its foreign policy. And for Iran, foreign policy is not run by President Rouhani and his nuclear team, but run by the Supreme Leader and IRGC and Quds Force. So I don't see they're going to change their foreign policy objectives fundamentally. But again, as I mentioned earlier, Nathan, that they are not in a comfortable position. They're hemorrhaging billions of dollars on Assad to keep him in power. So they're looking for some avenues to stop the violence and civil war in Syria. But again, the question is that they're not willing to really give up concessions, big concessions, to stop the violence.
Stephen, I want to bring you, Eric, quickly, yes.
Yeah, I just want to make the point that the Iranians have been fundamental in fighting ISIS, both inside of Iraq as well as what's now happening in Afghanistan. The Iranians see ISIL and the development of this organization as a major fundamental threat for the entire region. So it's less about Assad and influence in Syria, and it's more about the Iranians being able to preserve their own position and to fight terrorism throughout the region.
Eric, point well taken. Many people feeling their positions threatened as Syria dissolves. Stephen, I want to bring you back in here. The negotiations, okay, the UN is trying, but who can you negotiate with in terms of the opposition to Bashar al-Assad? Obviously, ISIL is not going to be at the table. The Nusra Fund, which have allied with al-Qaeda, which are the strongest opposition group, weren't. And then we have the Syrian Free Army, which doesn't seem to have much popular support either amongst people inside Syria and the refugee population, which of course is burgeoning.
Well, I think this is getting to the complicated part of the whole deal, which is that, yes, you do have in these insurgencies, and who really can have the persuasive power over them. I mean, I think the point made that cutting off arms shipments to them would be a powerful impact on some of the insurgencies.
Is that possible?
Clearly, that means that, well, we'll see. But, you know, clearly the issue of Turkey and Saudi Arabia maybe coming back and saying, listen, if you want more arms, you have to start getting into a negotiation. But that also applies to the Iranian and Russian side. They have to say to Assad, we're going to cut off aid to you if you refuse to get into negotiations. That's the only way I can see it happening. I think the idea that this is being imposed from the outside is unfortunate, but I think it actually is the dynamic that would make it work. Because otherwise, I don't see the two parties, I mean, the two sides in Syria themselves coming into any agreement unless there is pressure from the outside.
Well, I mean, you talk about two sides, but of course there are so many sides now. Majid, it seems that the winners in this conflict 4 years on have actually been jihadists. How does everyone get together and actually make sure this doesn't become more of a threat and put it back in its box?
You know, Nathan, you brought up a very interesting point before.
Sorry, Stephen, I'm just going to speak to Majid first, and then you can pick up.
Yeah, you just mentioned, Nathan, that you brought up different kind of groups that they are not on the table when these power are talking. Yeah. They're offering a plan. So this is really important. I think what you mentioned is really the critical question here. That if you don't have those groups that are fighting on the ground, you don't have representatives from those groups. So how do you want your plan, top-down plan, to work? And I think if you want to take a step, again, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but if you want to take a step, you have to talk to regional powers first of all, instead of having all those neighboring countries. I think we ignored completely the neighboring, like Jordan, Lebanon, those countries who had a lot of refugees, to see what are their plans. We're just having these powers, Russia, United States, Iran, and we ignore basically neighboring countries. And last thing I have to say, Nathan, that this conflict is, again, it has four concentric circles of tensions: one domestic, rebels group with Assad, rebels group with each other; one regional between pro-Assad, Iran, Hezbollah, and anti-Assad, Saudi Arabia and other countries. It's global, Russia and United States on the other side, and there is now, like what you said, global jihad, which they are winning. So there are so many circles here.
Majid, I just want to pick up with Stephen because we're running out of time. Does the solution have to come from the region, given the regional control, given the regional influences within Syria?
Well, of course it has to come from the region, but it also has to come from the great powers, who, after all, are shipping all the arms in on both sides. The other problem is, of course, that the UN, the UN has been successful in settling other conflicts, places like Guatemala, El Salvador, Angola, Mozambique. And when the UN is successful is when the parties, and obviously there are more than two parties here, agree that they cannot win, and they finally say they're exhausted, they're out of money, they're out of arms. They just say, listen, we really want peace. Eric, so that's when the UN comes in as a neutral arbiter.
Eric, last word.
And that's when.
Eric, last word.
You're going to have peace.
Stephen's point. Are we at that point now? Are we at that point now where all the parties are exhausted enough to talk about peace?
In one sense, yes.
I don't think so.
fact of the matter is that Assad has no one to negotiate with, and so the notion that outside powers have to be involved, I think, is quite correct. But the reality is these regional countries, Jordan and Lebanon, they take the diktats of the United States, which is their primary ally. It is the United States that has to lean on Turkey and on Saudi Arabia in order to cut off that funding. Those rebels inside of Syria cannot continue to operate no matter how many of them there are if their weapons and their financing are cut off. Once that happens and you can have an actual political resolution, then you could see a settlement that might be beneficial for the people of Syria. But until that time, civil war will continue because the government cannot simply capitulate to no enemy other than its outside adversaries.